Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to share some of my research ideas with you at a time when a number of countries have implemented their first phase of marine planning. So I think that's a good time for all of us to be reflecting on how things are going. In the first part of my talk, I want to reflect more generally on marine planning and explore some basic definitions. Then in the third, fourth, and fifth part of my talk, I want to explore ways in which we might go about evaluating the planning process, respectively through the ideas of governance theories, comparative analysis, and benchmarks and standards. And then finally, the webinar will finish with a couple of discussants, Chris and Daniel, who can share their stories of implementing regional marine plans. I'm really glad about that because perhaps a lot of what I'll have to say will be a little bit theoretical. So it would be great that Chris and Dan will be able to bring us down to earth in the real world. Much of what I'm seeking to present in this paper can be found in a journal article written with the kind collaboration of Kira G in Marine Policy. And if you can't get access to that article, I'm very happy to share the author proof with you. Just email me on the contact email shown here. So, marine planning or marine spatial planning, or sometimes known as a maritime spatial planning, or even integrated coastal and ocean planning. How can we understand it? Trying to rehearse some basic definitions. Well, one way we could think about it is to ask, why is it being done? And I think if we look at the oceans, we can understand that there are a range of environmental impacts being caused by human pressures and activities. And also the oceans are getting very busy. There's a human competition for space in the oceans. I think in the UK, actually, there have been calls for planning of the ocean, as there has been on the land since the 1970s. But I think it was recently the advent, I would say, of development of large areas of offshore wind farms from the mid-2000s onwards that convinced the UK government that it was worth having a system of marine planning to manage some of the potential conflicts that would arise. So in Sunrise Bay, why? Nations have decided that there's enough human activity going on in the oceans and there's sufficient threats to the environment that we need to conduct some form of holistic advanced planning for marine space. Where? Well, MSP has exploded really from the early 2000s, and now it's ascertained that 126 countries and territories have area-based policies through marine spatial planning as of 2023. And that's according to an assessment by IOC UNESCO in their State of the Oceans report in 2024. And so you can see the map here is a little bit out of date, in fact, from 2019, but you can see from the color coding how MSP developed in the dark blue regions in Northwest Europe and China, but it's also been given additional impetus by a European Union directive on maritime spatial planning. So what actually is a marine plan? Actually, I think it really varies around the world, but usually I would say it's a suite of documents rather than a single document within a wider marine planning system. And here you can see an example from the UK. In the UK, we have an overarching marine policy statement, which the home nations sign up to. And then to give just one example, in Scotland, there's Scotland's National Marine Plan from 2015, which has presently been updated. There are 81 policies in that, but also a range of supporting documents, appraisals and assessments, many hundred pages, in fact, of documents. And then in Scotland, then below that, there's a regional tier of regional marine plans that's been developed for some areas. And there's obviously other things in the marine planning system, like the regulatory system and the supporting information systems. So altogether, something quite large and complex. But the plan output is not the only thing. Just as important as the plan output is a planning process, a process of engaging various stakeholders. And you can see here in this diagram, the process laid out according to the English marine planning system. It involves a number of phases. And in this system, there's considerable ambition for stakeholder engagement. And you can see at the end of the cycle, there's some kind of aspiration to do some kind of review and monitoring. Actually, I think sometimes the review or evaluation phrase can suffer because people can run out of time or money or enthusiasm. So, and also there's an additional argument that the reviewing needs to be done mid-phase. And in fact, if we're going to do reviewing, we actually need to set some measures or indicators right at the beginning, which we can collect data on. So I think it's an important phase, but it's sometimes not an easiest phase to achieve. In the second introductory part of my talk, I just want to reflect a bit more generally about the idea of planning. So, do you make plans? What do you do when you make plans? What even is planning? If we're trying to think about it, reflect on it. And I think it's got something to do with the idea of explicitly preparing for the future. So in the next slide, I want to look a few slides. I want explicitly at the academic discipline of planning. I'm not trained as a planner, but I think there's been land use, or what's sometimes called urban and regional planning, around for a number of years on land. So what does it have to say about planning? And has marine planning, or can marine planning draw on some of these ideas? Well, there's been planning around since ancient times, plans for building ancient cities and designing their layout. The earliest town planning legislation in the UK dates back to 1909 in Liverpool, when there was an act to try and think more about the quality of housing and also deal with environmental issues in urban areas. Post-World War II, in the UK, certainly planning took off, and that's around about the 1960s, around about the time was the approach called rational systematic planning really dominated. This form of planning was and is quite expert-led, and the idea is to amass a range of technical assessments and think more rationally about how development is approved and make plans for future space. But there's been criticisms of that approach of rational planning, relying on the experts or how data hungry it is. And certainly there's been evolutions of planning theory since that time. The sevenfold approach I've got here is just a snapshot. Certainly in the 1980s and 1990s, a form of planning called environmental planning came to be more central, and that was particularly as sustainability or sustainable development became legally mandated as a goal of planning. And then coming up to the 1990s, here with a picture of Patsy Healy, ideas more based around collaborative planning, where the planner or leader of the process and the experts are playing more facilitating role to get a group of people involved in a planning process. So expert coordinated, but less expert led. Certainly ideas or concepts to do with spatial planning that I'll go on to in the next slide. And finally, more recently, in what I would call a more postmodern age, there's been a range of ideas around what's called fuzzy planning. And here the idea is the planner is perhaps stepping even further back in the process, quite a contested process in which they're helping stakeholders who have very different and contrasting views and needs understand how their aspirations differ from one another. So in fact, through these different planning theories, we get the ideas of slightly different models for planning systems or slightly different roles for planners. And you might say that marine planning has, for one reason or another, drawn on the rational systematic planning and maybe not to date learned so much from land use planning theory, but there remain to be opportunities there. What about the S in planning? So I've titled my talk Marine Planning, but it's often referred to as marine spatial planning. Well, in land use planning, the notion of spatial planning developed in the 1990s 80s and 90s as thinkers began to think there was a problem with just zoning towns for having shopping here, housing here, and other forms of development there, and that they saw that planning needs to play a much broader role, as you can see exhibited in this spatial plan for the region near me, the land use plan for Tay Plan, looking at the relationships between economic cores and centres, thinking about economic components, thinking about the relationship between economic, social and environmental processes. So that's the vision for it in land use planning. In marine spatial planning, it's been the S for spatial has been more centered around the idea of zoning, that we can zone parts of the ocean and think about what marine uses we have there. Now, with the growing raising of the idea of co-location of activities, there's some questions around whether zoning really is the answer, but still it is a form of spatial strategy to deal with conflicts. You know, we'll have the kite surfers here and we'll have the power boaters there. But marine planning has definitely developed out of its own tradition, not necessarily the same tradition as terrestrial planning. And there are antecedents to marine planning. One notion was the idea of sea use management, which developed in the 1970s. And you can see on the left here a diagram from integrated licensing areas in the North Sea in the 1980s. Another classic example has been the Great Barrier Reef, which developed its zoning scheme for its ocean area since the 1980s. Quite an influential example. So having rehearsed a few basic ideas there about what's going on with marine planning and what do we mean by planning, I'd like to get on to the main body of my talk and thinking about evaluating marine planning. I would say evaluating marine planning is complex and difficult. It also could be problematic and it gives rise to some unwelcome information, how we haven't managed to achieve these very bold objectives of having thriving economies, of having improved living, of having improved environment. That might be uncomfortable information for the practitioners about when we evaluate marine planning about why we haven't managed to achieve that. But it might not even be the practitioner's fault. There might be other issues that have come in and stopped marine planning achieving its goals, or it might be because of some preconditions that we didn't put in place. We didn't resource this planning process enough. I do think Stephen Olson's order of outcomes framework provides a very helpful overview of thinking about the different ways in which we can think about what MSP is trying to achieve and how we might measure it. He starts off with the preconditions for success and argues that unless we have things like the human capacity, the trust and social capital, the finance and the political support and mandate, we might be setting marine planning up to fail. So do we have those preconditions in place? Also, we can think quite practically about the outputs of marine planning. He calls this the first and second order achievements. So have we produced the plans we said we were going to produce? Have we produced sensible, smart policies? Have we created trust and engagement in the process? But beyond that planning process, which is probably the slightly easier sort of outputs of marine planning to measure, there are broader outcomes of marine planning that its policies are hoping to achieve, be they environmental or economic or social, and they're themselves contributing to a broader notion of sustainability for our oceans and coasts. And it's often quite difficult to trace the links between marine planning and those broader outcomes because lots of other things are influencing those outcomes, like the state of the economy or other broader processes in governance, planning and management. But I think there's one overall big challenge for marine planning, which relates to a criticism of planning that I'd like to draw out. And this is the idea that planning is a process looking for a purpose. I'll say that again. Planning is a process looking for a purpose. And I want to introduce here in this part of my talk 5 key governance theories, which I can think provide a lot of potential for providing us some criteria for evaluation when we're evaluating marine planning, because they think about what the process, what the goals or purposes of marine planning could be. So first of all, I'll start with one which I think is arguably the dominant framework for marine spatial planning, and that is the framework of the ecosystem approach, sometimes also referred to as ecosystem-based management. In the research I did for this paper in 2020, a commitment to ecosystem-based management was reflected in 14 out of 35 plans that we reviewed. So about 35% of marine planning initiatives saying that, in essence, marine planning is a way to implement ecosystem-based management. Now, I think this framework is aided by the fact that it's codified in the Convention on Biodiversity, the Malawi Principles. And you can see here I've listed a range of those principles, and I've sort of classified them by key areas that they look at. Some of them are more human or social principles. Others are more ecological or environmental principles, and then principles of to do with the economy and to do with adaptive management. So the fact we have these principles codified, that helps us know what we're measuring. But I think one of the challenges is you look at any one of these principles and you think, how would I implement that in marine spatial planning, or how would we measure that there's a lot to do, there's a lot to go before you could get to that point to think about how these principles would be implemented in practice. I think there's also a challenge for marine planning where people keep on ranking marine planning against these principles, but rather we now need to start as we go to the second generation of marine planning worldwide is more pose the question, as we implement these principles, do they lead to the desired outcomes? A second set of governance theory that we could talk about is the good governance theory. This arose, I think, in fields outside of planning, arose in development literature as people struggled to deal with problems of, for example, corruption in aid and development. But now the finger has been pointed back, I suppose, to all of us as always think about what are principles of good governance that we believe ought to be morally implemented. And this gives rise to a range of principles like legitimacy, accountability, fairness, also other principles related to whether administration is competent or good leadership. And you can see in this table here on the right-hand side some attempts by Yves Enoch to translate those principles for marine spatial planning. So these principles more, I suppose, focus on the quality of the planning process. The challenge with these principles is I think there's much less agreement about them. Really, they're principles, I would say, that relate to the whole notion of democracy and human rights. So there's a fair bit of debate about them and they're less codified, but still important. For example, if we think that there needs to be stakeholder engagement or freedom of information in our marine planning systems. A third way or a third set of governance theories that I think are relevant are those to do with governance indices. So we're, I think, more used to the term indices or indexes when we think about environmental indicators or economic indicators, but we can think about governance indicators. And the way these often seem to work is that they group a set of components or activities that ought to be implemented into an overall index, and then say how the system's performing, whether it's performed, implemented elements that quote unquote ought to be here. And you can see here an example from the Economist Intelligence Unit for marine spatial planning. So arguing that there needs to be various kinds of policy and institutional capacity that we should implement in marine planning. Do we have the components in place for that? Fourthly, I think a really interesting area in the literature is to do with what we'd call modes or theories of governance. So there are debates about the way in which we should design planning systems, and Evans here outlines 5 key modes. The top one, I suppose, hierarchical, is the one where I suppose that tallies with rational, systematic planning, that approach where government takes the lead and it's very centralized. And then the other 4, networked and collaborative, market-based, adaptive or transformative, there are more emerging modes of governance where the government shares a lot more of the planning process with other actors and decenters themselves. Now, there's arguments in the literature about why these forms of governance have different strengths or weaknesses. So just to take a couple of examples, should we take a networked approach where we collaborate with the different partners, government coming together with business, scientists, NGOs and local communities, or should we take a market-based approach where we're going to use taxes and incentives? You can see that some of those approaches perform well on flexibility and some perform better or worse on commitment. But I guess what we're doing then as we evaluate marine planning against these modes of governance is we're trying to say, how can we design the institutional frameworks and the procedures for marine planning that would enable us to deliver these modes and evaluate against that? And a number of people have tried to do this. I'd point out, for example, the work of Lucy Greenhill as she looked at the principles of adaptive governance and reviewed how Scottish marine planning has or hasn't managed to implement that. I'd also draw out the work recently of Tegan Evans as she's done the same for the mode of transformative governance and look at the translation of that into marine planning. Then fifthly and finally, I want to come to a 5th theory of a multi-level governance. This governance theory comes a lot more from politics and political geography. One key thinker is a political geographer, Harriet Bulkley. And this takes the view that marine planning doesn't always operate according to the nice rational, linear, sequential steps that we might think it does. But in the real world, that we have a range of actors operating from international down to national, down to local scales. They're all getting involved in the planning process and seeking to influence it. So therefore, we have a process that's sort of characterized by people exercising power, pursuing their own interests, potentially negotiating with one another or maneuvering with one another. So multi-level governance theory just accepts that this is the way the real world works and thinks about how the planning process is engaging with that or dealing with that process of politics and power. So quite different from some of the other frameworks I presented. So what I want to really argue with is I think there's some benefit from a number of these modes of governance, and in some ways they shine a light on marine planning in different kinds of ways. So we could consider them as complementary. So for example, the good governance framing helps us think about the quality of our planning process. Do we have transparency? Do we have stakeholder engagement? The governance indices help us to perhaps sometimes semi-quantify criteria. Think about, are we performing not at all, moderately, weakly, or strongly on some component that we've put in place in marine planning. The modes of governance framework helps us evaluate the whole design of the planning process. Say something a little bit more than just did we do what we said we were going to do? And these broader notions of how we will need to design institutions if we want to achieve sustainability. Ecosystem-based management, as I said, I think is the dominant framework at the moment. And I think the key strength about that framework is embedded within it are core ecological and sustainability criteria. So that means we're trying to evaluate marine planning against those criteria. And like I said, multi-scalar governance, evaluating the interests and interactions between the agents. I'm sure there are other governance theories that could be relevant, and I'm reminded of many colleagues that might be on this call who I haven't mentioned, people like Stephen Jay, Brice Trullier, and the whole team from Queen's University Belfast who've bring into play other kinds of theories that I think could be relevant that you'll find in the literature. In the third and final part of my talk now, I want to come on to two other approaches that I think could be productive and that we could take forward as a group of practitioners and professionals and academics working in this field. And the first one I'm going to treat really quickly because I don't think I have too much time remaining. But what I want to say about this is about the power of comparison, and that sometimes if we want to evaluate how we're doing in marine planning, rather than evaluating marine planning against some sort of benchmark or standard, actually it's quite powerful to evaluate one attempt to do marine planning against another attempt to do marine planning and look at their relative performance. I think one of the reasons why this is quite powerful, important, is perhaps there's no one perfect way of doing things, but as we look at how two or more jurisdictions or regimes have tried to implement marine planning, we can see perhaps as we look against one another where each of them has succeeded or failed in different ways. In the United Kingdom, we've got some quite different process of implementing, subtly different process of implementing marine planning between the home nations of Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So I've been involved in some work with Rachel Shooksmith for the Scottish Parliament where we kind of compared and reviewed these processes. So in Scotland, we've had a National Marine Plan adopted in 2025, reviewed and now being updated, and a regional marine planning processes where three areas, Shetland, Clyde and Orkney, have had power devolved to the regional level to make regional marine plans. This contrasts with the approach in England, where we've had, again, no single national marine plan, but 11 or sometimes you might say 6 regional marine plans led by a single central government agency, the Marine Management Organisation, albeit the Marine Management Organisation has implementation officers that are based in the regions. And we've had a very extensive stakeholder consultation process. And just from the hearsay, I suppose you might say, comparing those two, sometimes people have talked about the Scottish approach being stronger in terms of devolving the power more regionally, and the English approach being more strong in terms of having a central lead agency that are directing the process, and also the energy put into the vision development phase of the process. I think comparisons can be really instructive. So as we did that comparison, I don't have time to dwell on this slide, but you can see the reference at the bottom where we report in more detail. One of the things we found, for example, is, yes, definitely that strength in the Scottish system where there was more devolved power, and how that worked quite well in regions like Orkney and Shetland, which they've gone down to the geographical level of communities. And indeed, perhaps there's an intention in English marine planning to go more to the local level. And there's been a report by Howell Marine Consulting about how that could be done. But having said that, as we've looked at the comparison, finding that was perhaps much less resource investment in regional marine planning in Scotland, and that's perhaps stymied some of those ambitions for regional engagement with the preconditions required for marine planning. So as we do this comparative analysis, I think there are a number of methodological quandaries, but in essence, what we're looking for is we're looking for similarities. Are there ways in which these processes both led to strong outcomes, but also looking for differences? Why did it vary? And sometimes why did it vary according to why it should vary, because these are very different contexts. So we would expect it to be different. One of the powerful approaches in comparative analysis is exploring the counterfactual. And when we do that, I think we have to ask questions such as, what would have happened without this regime? Okay, so we've got this marine planning regime that isn't ideal, but what would the level of conflicts be like without any marine planning process if we just left things to go? But all along, I think for all of the evaluation processes that we conduct, we've got a big challenge in attributing the influence of the planning process to the sustainability outcomes. That might be because it's too early in the day to assess the on-the-ground outcomes. So that ambition in the marine policy has not yet been achieved because it could take 5 or 10 years. Or it could be because of confounding influences coming in. You know, there's another objective in another policy stream to do with housing development on land or expansion of the economy that is compromising the ecological objectives, for example, in the marine plan. But there have been attempts to look at attribution. The European Union, in its review of the EU MSP directive, has attempted to cost how much money marine planning is saving by identifying trade-offs, particularly with offshore wind development. And then I think I'll just move on to talk about the whole idea of the counterfactual, which is something it's a bit tricky to evaluate. But I suppose in the counterfactual, you're trying to say, what would have happened if we didn't have this process in place? And obviously, there are a number of arguments from marine planning about the benefits that it brings compared to what was before. So in the UK marine planning, having more of an ecosystem focus as we look at the regions, having a champion organisation in government, having rationalised licensing systems, and not just relying on business drivers, although a number of people in this audience, I suppose, I think would question how far marine planning has gone towards aspirations of stewardship. Finally, I just want to finish my talk with a little bit of talk about quite a lot of work that I myself haven't done, but I'm interested to look at, which is the creation of more practical evaluation standards and benchmarks. There are a number of these out there, and they are growing and evolving. Not quite as crazy as the situation for marine protected areas, I don't think, but there are lots of different benchmarks and standards. And I think it would be a shame if these mushroom so much that there's not comparability between them. And I think it would be good if these standards could draw on some more of this theoretical thinking. But just to draw out an example of one standard that's come from a more academic background, and that's the preconditions for successful marine planning that have been developed by Rachel Zurcher and her team, reported in the literature in this diagram here. So in that work, they look at 16 examples of marine spatial planning and try and consolidate from those examples 19 conditions that they think are important for marine planning, against which you can evaluate it in 4 key areas: the plan attributes, the plan development, putting in place the legal context, and putting together the broader integration, which I would say is part of the broader marine planning system. There are also, though, a range of existing benchmarks, standards, and evaluation tools. And I've just drawn out 6 here in the diagram. I don't have time to go into them, but starting off from 2014, the first IOC UNESCO Guide to Evaluation Report 70, and then coming out of the IC stable, the IC's Marine Spatial Planning Quality Management System, bottom left. That's one that actually tallies with ISO international standards. Then looking across the middle here, we have RAMA's Marine Spatial Planning Index, and also the work done by the EU Baltic Scope project to look at transboundary marine spatial planning standards. And then on the right-hand side here, bang up to date in 2024 and 2025, again, a couple of standards that come out of IOC UNESCO, the guide from 2024 and the rapid assessment methodology from 2025. And I'd say in general, these standards take the approach of, like the governance indices, either trying to create an overall framework for evaluation or having components and asking the evaluator to say, are or aren't those components in place? So coming to the end of my talk and trying to bring it home with some take-home messages. Systems of marine planning have been in place since the late 2000s, and they're exploding now to 126 countries worldwide. MSP itself takes a very different approach, but in general, it involves developing a complex suite of marine plan documents and assessments. And equally important as the planning documents are the planning process, which have this aspiration to collaboratively develop visions and objectives. Evaluating the effectiveness of MSP is complex, with orders of outcomes ranging from preconditions to implementation to real-world outcomes. I'm going to argue that theoretical perspectives are important for thinking about evaluation. You know, what's the overall purpose of marine planning? Without this, evaluation is limited to the pragmatics of, did we do what we said we were going to do? And now I'm not saying that's important. That's really important for a team to have its internal targets and evaluation to do. But something like ecosystem-based management, lift our eyes to talk about the dominant set of principles that should be driving MSP. I think we need to go beyond the approach of just doing a checklist of, you know, is MSP performing against these principles? And the academics need to kind of raise their game and ask, when they implement these principles, is it leading to the outcomes that we would expect? And if not, why not? Comparative analysis allows us to learn from the relative performance of different programs. And it's also great, I think, for systematically stealing ideas. You know, practitioners love to see how another regime has tried to do it and pick up ideas from real-world practice. But in order to do this, we need to overcome those challenges of working out what is contingent for a given place, what we might expect to be unique to that, or how we can attribute achievements to the planning process. And my argument would lead to that academics should collect evidence about how well real-world MSPing is performed and work in practitioners in partnership to do evaluation. And this, for the academics, could provide them evidence about middle-range theories on what works best to consolidate our learning. And the benchmarks and standards provide more practical codified tools for evaluation. So ideally, those two should be learning from one another and refining in an ongoing process that will be a good piece of work that I could think will last over the next decade. Finishing there, I want to move on now to invite my colleagues to talk. So over to Chris to bring us to the real world practical examples. Sorry, Chris, I'm just turning my camera off so that they can see you. Go ahead, Chris. Can you talk? Thank you.
Should just be getting Chris to unmute, but there we go. We should be able to hear you now, Chris.
That's great.
Excellent. There we go.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. That was, as always, really interesting and a great sort of perspective and overview of the nuts and bolts of what myself and Daniel later are trying to implement regionally. I'm Chris Cutts. I'm one of 2 officers for the Clyde Marine Planning Partnership, and we're one of the 3 Scottish Marine regions going forward with drafting a statutory plan for our regions. Choosing the title, we're concerned with the Clyde Marine region, otherwise known as the Firth of Clyde and the Clyde Sea. That extends from the tidal limit of the River Clyde all the way up past Glasgow into Renfrewshire and out to the outer firths in Argyll and Ayrshire. And as per Marine Act, in terms of setting out marine regional planning, the marine high water spring tide out to 12 nautical miles. So it's a very big, complex area, 1,256 kilometres of coastline, over 3,500 kilometres of sea area. It's a fjord, technically, or a fjord, separated from the Irish Sea by the Clyde Sea Sill, which runs from the Mull of Kintyre down to South Ayrshire, which makes it makes it essentially sort of an inland sea, which makes it very important in terms of sort of ecosystem management and fish population, certainly. Public authorities, the Marine Planning Partnership, which I'll come on to, is divided up into public authorities, recreation, protection enhancement, and commerce. A lot of them obviously sort of overlapping in terms of their jurisdictions and interests and agendas. But that is the Clyde Marine Planning Partnership members. I think on to the next slide, Tim. Yes, establishing the Marine Planning Partnership was no small task in itself. Happening back in after the National Marine Plan was drafted in 2015, we were evolved from a coastal partnership which had sort of non-statutory duties. It was a voluntary coastal partnership, the Firth of Clyde Forum. Within the Firth of Clyde Forum, there was a specific initiative to look into voluntary marine spatial planning in the Clyde under the auspices of the SSMEI, the Scottish Sustainable Marine Environment Initiative, and the Clyde Partnership, the Clyde Forum, sorry, at the time, drafted a marine spatial plan in the 3 or 4 years of that project. It's a very complex region, very large, as I've already said. It's got 8 local authorities with, tasked obviously with terrestrial planning, and a national park, Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, sort of has some coastline in the far north of our area, around Loch Long in Erica. When we originally considered the governance of how to make a marine planning partnership work, given that it was going to have statutory duties, one of the early models considered was the Clyde Forum staying in existence and advising a delegate of less than 10 individuals from around the area with various specialisms. That was deemed not to be workable by Marine Scotland at the time. It was too Quango-like. So the model that they eventually settled on in sort of 2016, 2017, was for the forum to sort of transform, to cease existence as a coastal partnership, but to arise from the ashes as the delegate with every member of the Marine Planning Partnership as the delegate to draft the plan, with a board, an executive board of public authorities from around the local authorities. And that leads us on to the actual marine planning process, where the first statutory duty that obviously had to be carried out was a condition assessment of the Clyde. And from publishing of that condition assessment back in 2017 to host stakeholder workshops, really sort of ramp up public engagement, consult on the outputs from the public engagement and stakeholder workshops to develop a plan, with further meetings and workshops to really sort of like fine tune it. The stage we're at now is, as you can see, sort of 3 steps down from the top of that pyramid. We're at the draft plan stage, and we hope to go to full public consultation early in next year, 2026. There is the option to have an independent review of the plan before going to plan adoption, approval by Scottish ministers. All through that process, obviously, there's been ongoing communication and engagement, which has been sort of codified by our own statement of public participation and also hand in glove with the plans, with the plan when it goes out to consultation, will be the associated assessments, the strategic environmental assessment, habitats, equality, the BRIA Islands impact, and so on, as part of the sort of statutory obligations to a statutory plan. And that's all I have time for, but these are my contact details if you do want to find out more about it. It's standard. I work for NatureScot. Well, I'm sort of hosted by NatureScot, so it's a standard NatureScot email. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Tim. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. So, yes, hello everyone. I'm Danny Morris. I'm a marine planner for Orkney Islands Council. So I only have about 4 minutes, so it'll be quite brief, but I'll give you a quick overview of where we are with our own regional marine plan and how that process has worked for us and a few talking points around it. So I've learned to never start a talk about Orkney without just reminding people, first of all, whereabouts we are. So that's us on the north coast there, and you can see our marine region. And that's where our regional marine plan will apply to. So it's around 100,000 kilometers squared, so quite a substantial area. It's actually about 10 times the size of Orkney's land mass. So yeah, it's a big area. Go on to the next slide, please. So we're very lucky here in Orkney to have an incredibly biodiverse marine environment. We've got some of the most intact seagrass beds and mill beds in the country. I go diving when I can, and it really is stunning underwater here. Get the next slide, please. But alongside that, we also have an incredibly busy marine economy. So we're one of the busiest cruise destinations in the UK. Around 15% of Scotland's farmed salmon comes from Orkney. 10% of the UK's oil output flows through Flotta, one of the islands here. We have the European Marine Energy Centre testing tidal and wave energy. If you can think of it, it's probably going on somewhere in Orkney. So this, to me, means that regional marine planning is really extremely important to have in place here. Go to the next slide, please. So just to explain the governance, because we're quite unique in the way that it's set up here. So Orkney Islands Council is the sole delegate responsible for developing the regional marine plan and the statutory duties that come along with that delegation. So we're effectively a marine planning partnership of just one, but that we then work closely with an advisory group. So that's those organisations you can see at the bottom of the screen there, and they represent a range of different interests from different organisations around Orkney. So when we develop policies and guidance documents and things like that, we consult closely with the advisory group. Okay, next slide, thank you. So this is just a sort of high-level timeline of the process so far. So we got our delegation in 2020 to begin developing the regional marine plan. Just before that, similar to in the Clyde, we did our state of the environment assessment. You can see there through 2021 was when we began drafting the plan with assistance from the advisory group. We did some early engagement as well to find out what people wanted to see in the plan, what they didn't want to see in the plan. Through 2023, the consultation draft was reviewed by the Marine Directorate as the final check before we got the go-ahead in 2024 to do our consultation. And that's what we did at the end of 2024. We consulted on the draft plan, and we're now in the process of reviewing the feedback from the consultation and updating the plan. So we are hopeful that we are getting quite close now to a final version and being submitted up to Scottish ministers. Thank you. So in theory, I just wanted to mention this, that Scotland's approach to regional marine planning, it is absolutely brilliant, and it has the potential to be one of the best approaches in the world, in my opinion. It's the location-specific plans, and they're being written by the organisations that operate in those regions. So we can tailor the plan and the policies within it to the specific issues and the specific needs of the community. And because it's been delegated to organisations like us at the council to develop, we can engage at a scale that's relevant to the community as well. So we can get out there to all the different islands, to the different areas, and speak to a whole range of businesses and members of the public and schools to get young voices to a level of detail that's not really possible at the national level. We're able to sort of go next level above living in these communities. Okay, next slide, please. And the marine plan itself is sort of just the beginning of the process, and there's a lot of, it can act as almost a springboard, a platform for further projects as well. So I don't have time to go into these right now, but there's just an example there of our fish farming spatial guidance that we're working on, where we can go into quite a hyper level of detail into things like, in this instance, the different constraints for fish farm development and identify appropriate areas for further development. We can do things like work on enhancement and restoration guidance that can link with the policies in the marine plan. So looking into the future, we can really continue to build on the marine plan once it's published. Next slide, please. So that's just about all from me then. Just a few thoughts to wrap up. That the regional marine planning process in Scotland, it's been a learning curve for all involved. It's one of the first cases where it's been done to this level of detail and delegation to the regions. And I think the process has been improving over time as lessons have been learned. The regions, to be successful, I think the regions, they need more autonomy than they currently have and adequate funding to go along with that. But as I said before, there is this very big potential for regional marine planning in Scotland to be a brilliant case study and a brilliant example of how it can be done with community involvement. Thank you.